sure Ama, are you on?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm here.
Okay, brilliant.
I'm
So we can hear you.
muted. Yeah, I'll stay muted until you need me.
Right, perfect. Thank you, Ama. I was also hoping a colleague of mine, Clare Crawford from WWF UK, was going to be on, but she's seeing her son, who's at university this evening. So she's doing that. More important things to do, but that's absolutely fine. So what we're going to talk about is managing political risk and uncertainty, and this is actually really very much Ama's work. She was the person that we went through an open process to contract to come and support us on a learning and research exercise on this topic. And she's spoken to a number of organizations, many within CMP, also some individuals from CCNet, and also a little bit outside. So Ama, do you want to just say hello to everybody, introduce yourself briefly, and then I'll go through the presentation.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Ama Marston. I am an independent consultant with an environmental background as well as background working on international development, responsible business, etc., and issues like risk and resilience. And Will is going to present a lot of what we found, much of it coming from the conversations with you. And I just want to thank the many people that I spoke to who were extremely generous with their feedback as well as their enthusiasm for getting this process started. And I think it's very much the beginning of a conversation for the sector and for those of you involved. But this has been one of my favorite projects I've worked on recently because the people I spoke to were just such enthusiastic, genuine people doing good work. So with further ado, I'll let Will get into the meat and then we'll jump back in and be available for questions.
Thank you, Ama. Yeah, this was the background in terms of what we wanted to achieve, and this seemed like a really important topic, but also a challenging one. I guess many of us face political risk and uncertainty in our context, but the trouble is it's in all sorts of different ways and at different scales, at different levels, and of different types. So we were trying to get a sense of how do organizations deal with this in the conservation sector. And we were conscious that we couldn't necessarily set out to say, look, here's a recipe for what you would do. But on the other hand, we wanted to push ourselves, we wanted to push Ama to try and help us come out with what you might call early guidance. So some indications of whether it be principles or approaches or some tools maybe that we could suggest to people to take this forward in their different contexts. So with that, let's move on to the next slide, Caroline. Yeah, can you just click on, Caroline?
Yeah, sorry, I'm
It's
trying.
not a bad thing, yeah.
Okay, there we go.
All right, I'll keep talking. So just in terms of the methodology, Ama was doing somewhat of a literature review, but also carrying out a number of interviews with about 24 organizations, individuals within the conservation sector, also across international development, philanthropy, risk, M&E type functions. So a variety of functions in organizations and also in diverse situations. So in terms of geographically in North America and Europe, yes, it's fair to say there were quite a few representing those regions, but we did also have a number of people from other regions or representing other regions of the world. And yes, also a few with private sector. Generally speaking, whilst it would be great to be able to share a number of examples of practice, it wasn't that easy to do, partly because it's not that easy to come out with systematic examples sometimes of what people are actually doing, but also because sometimes things are quite politically sensitive. So it's not easy to describe things necessarily in very open ways and write them down. But we do have a report. So just to go with this presentation, there's a report which Caroline will post imminently if it's not done already. And so you'll be able to look through that at your leisure. Also to note that the process itself was relatively short. It was only about 6 weeks. So Also, you might just remember that we had a previous presentation that I did a few months ago, getting on a year ago now probably, in terms of conservation policy and advocacy work in general. And I gave an example, and Nico Burnish also gave an example. The one I was talking about was the forest campaign in WWF UK. It was just an example of how things can hit and change your context. In this particular situation, we had some pretty good plans. We'd worked out all sorts of scenarios, had some good political analysis, and then the whole Brexit thing happened in the UK, and that really changed things, of course. And it was good to have all the analysis that we did have, and we can still pick up and use that, but it's all somewhat on pause for this time, for the time being. But we're keen to still build on what we have in terms of relationships and people. And actually, a lot of the principles that you could say had been built into that forest campaign work, you could say are also some of the principles that Ama found were important in some of the organizations that she's been dealing with. So we'll come to some of those principles as we go through. Next slide, please. So political risks, it's fair to say these are an increasing part of daily realities for many of us. There's not really any particular global definition of what we mean by this. So Ama was, to some extent, trying to work out what are we saying we actually mean, what are we trying to deal with. Typically, we're concerned about governments as a main contributor to political risk or related agencies. And we know that if conservation organizations are not paying attention to the political landscape and uncertainty, they may either miss major effects in the wider world that can really derail projects, they can derail policy efforts. And at the same time, we shouldn't just be too negative about this. A number of organizations, Ama found, pointed out that it can also create opportunities, sometimes maybe to propose new projects or form new alliances, or different opportunities to influence policy. But this slide just shows a number of the different things, ways that you might see uncertainty and risk expressed in a government context in particular. Just click on, and that can also lead to other issues, maybe with your partner organizations, the risk and the uncertainty and the dynamism cause fragmentation. Or equally, the way you're approaching things may be perceived to be being too closely aligned with one political party, or if you are too closely aligned with the one political party and it completely flips to something else, then you're in trouble. And even this was an interesting one we didn't necessarily expect in terms of youth movements, but some people were citing that youth movements, the younger generation, sometimes might even question the legitimacy of some conservation organizations, of NGOs in general, and perceive them as maybe part of the establishment too much. And that's not something we were necessarily expecting as a finding. So next one, please. So how do we begin to think about some of the areas, some of the issues that are before us? And of course, many of us, we've all got different contexts. We're all in different situations. But Ama did a great job actually at trying to pull together some general principles of things to think about. So by domain, that's really what are we, those are factors relating to, is it international uncertainty we're talking about? Is it national level, or is it local power structures and dynamics? And that relates to this point that some people call big P and little p. And by big P, people mean party politics, which is more typical maybe in Western democracies, which tends to dominate a lot. Or when we talk about little p, that's more at the local level, and how power relations and corruption work there, irrespective of which party nationally is in power. And that might be a more dominant and important factor in, say, rural areas of developing countries sometimes. And then also to think about, so when we're talking about this risk and uncertainty, are we talking about chronic or acute risks? So are they chronic risks which are ongoing, and we know that typically the government is dysfunctional in a particular place, and therefore in some ways they're relatively predictable, and you can work out ways to manage that. Or are they more acute risks, which could be really hard to foresee, and they just flare up out of seemingly nothing? So, for example, it might have been hard to predict that the current US leadership might withhold Congress-approved funds for conservation because that hadn't really happened in that way to the same extent before. And that then, if you click on that, then other factors to think about. So, okay, we might identify different issues, but what's their likelihood? What's their impact? So typical things we might think about in risk analysis. And then if you click on, so what are we prepared? What's our preparedness to do something about that? What are the opportunities that maybe arise sometimes due to changing circumstances, and what action might we take? And so that leads us to maybe think then, if these are some of the issues, we've got to consider, okay, as an organization, as a program, how can we get into this topic? How can we get good analysis? Do we have the type of people in place that can give us warning or response and adaptation? And do we have mechanisms for learning about how we're doing? So next one. So in terms of responding then, so what did Ama find in terms of key trends and considerations? Different structures, of course, and modes of operation. Some organizations maybe have the capacity to be involved in a particular place over a really long time, over decades. And particularly in places where there's little weak infrastructure and great political risk, if you can really stick in with somewhere for a long time, that might allow you to ride out that political risk and be a really trusted, engaging partner for local partners, for example. But not everybody's in that situation. So you've really got to consider, where are you and what's your mode of operation? What are your expectations? And then in terms of thinking and working politically, that's something that, again, varies very much between organizations and ways that people are operating. Some organizations might have strong levels of political influence. Maybe they've got their leaders can have quite good access to government or levels of government. They can get ministers access on quite short notice. They can navigate relationships with changing governments. They've got good antennae and relationships to be able to do that and to build those partnerships. Others may not be so much in that position. It could be quite variable. And maybe a couple of points there that are interesting to think about. Identifying opportunities. Whilst uncertainty and risk can be disruptive, we shouldn't just always think about it that way. We shouldn't always just think, maybe, oh, let's get out of this, it's too risky. Maybe some organizations would argue that that's the time that conservation organizations should get involved and be there and provide stability and protection until the conflict, say, ends or a community heals itself. And then maybe just to note the sort of political reality sometimes that in some areas, at least, there's somewhat a global move away from science. So we talk a lot about science, of course, in the conservation standards and the need for strong evidence. And of course, that's absolutely right. But we also notice that the political reality that poses real challenges for science-based work and that we have to operate in that context and be really thoughtful about what's the level of evidence that we actually need for a particular audience in a given situation. And then in terms of our relationships, another real important factor, what are our relationships? We've talked a bit about this with government and different aspects of government and maybe cross-party and diverse stakeholders. If you've got a diversity of stakeholders that you're engaged with, maybe that allows you to be more stable and to ride out uncertainty. And indeed, at the end people that we're maybe keen to support and work with in terms of local or indigenous communities, if we've got good relationships there, strong relationships, again, maybe that helps us to be more resilient. So moving on. So if we come to actual tools, and I will ask Ama just to talk about the scenario planning example in a moment. Ama's view is that, look, you've got some good basic tools to build on within the open standards, the conservation standards, as we're calling them. So let's not try and come up with completely different framings. And so I think from our point of view in CMP, that's a positive thing to be saying. It would have been worrying to come up with something completely different. So, but what can we do to build on that? And that diagram on the right, I guess, is just emphasizing more the point towards the bottom, where typically especially in those sort of dynamic situations, having conscious and regular and disciplined pause and reflect type sessions. So cycles within our overall cycle can be super important to do. And certainly my experience of working in the more policy advocacy area is that that's really important. Stakeholder analysis and engagement, being more thoughtful and deeper perhaps about that. We probably do need to enhance our guidance in that area and push on that further within our conservation standards. And I'm sure there are opportunities to do that. And more generally, if we think about political analysis, whilst we mention it, of course we mention it, and we sort of take it as something that's important within our conservation standards, and when we're doing situation analysis and so on, we don't actually say that much about how to do it or how to go forward with it. But whatever you do, whatever tools you use, maybe it's something, again, you should do that as part of your conservation standards work and your cycle. Don't try and come up with some completely necessarily new and different way of doing it. So Ama, maybe you could just speak to the sort of scenario planning example.
Sure. Excuse me. Well, I think as Will said, you guys already have a great set of tools in the open standards that have been refined over many years. And so I would hate for any of us to be suggesting that something new needs to be created that would then distract from the use of these tools that many of you have come to be familiar with, value, etc. But there are things that can be added in from other disciplines, and scenarios planning is something that gets used a lot in foresight and futures planning. There are many complicated levels of it, which again, for your use doesn't need to be so complicated, but it's simply thinking about, what's the best case scenario, what's the worst case scenario of a political change, is there a neutral scenario or an alternate scenario, and trying to think about within each of those scenarios, what would the conservation risk or change be? Is there a conservation opportunity? Are there ways in which this would affect your stakeholders, or you would need to call upon your stakeholders in different ways to either address the best case or the worst case? Looking at things like what needs to happen now. Are we prepared for these different scenarios? And do we have the budget to respond to them? And so in the report that I've put together, there's a very simple matrix, and some of this is coming out of things that CMP members are already doing that, again, are very simple, but come to the heart of scenarios planning, which can then become more complex. And one of the organizations that I talked to and was able to share an example from really hammered home how important this can be. So there was a consortium of charities that were working together to map where renewable energy should be placed geographically so that it wouldn't negatively impact conservation or wildlife. And this organization was very well established, or this consortium was very well established with the Obama administration. And all of their plans, therefore, were predicated on working with the federal government. And all of a sudden, with this upset in the 2016 US elections, suddenly they found themselves in a very different position with an administration that was not only unfriendly, but rather hostile to conservation. And so it meant that they had to be able to think about how they were going to have an impact, since they suddenly didn't have the inroads that would allow them to make the changes they had anticipated. And so this consortium got together and had a planning session, I believe, with the help of one of the foundations, or one of the more facilitator type of organizations that could provide outside perspective. And they essentially had a reflect and adapt workshop and looked at different scenarios of what would happen now that there was this hostile government in place and who the other actors are in that space around influencing renewable energy on land where there are also conservation goals and impacts. And it led them to identify the fact that the private sector has all of this activity right now around purchase agreements to ensure demand for renewable energy. They also realized that there's a huge body of research that's taking place around development of technologies to reduce the impact of renewable energy on wildlife. And so they could influence that research and make sure that the new technology gets put into practice by companies. And then they also realized that there were actors in terms of local governments and the placement of renewables on non-federal lands. And so, you know, there were these three other scenarios, and they decided that given the uncertainty in the US landscape, in a way that, you know, many of us, if not all of us here in the US have not experienced before, that they would put energy into the various scenarios and see which took hold. And interestingly enough, they found that by doing the multi-prong approach and looking at the different scenarios, they were able to have a lot of impact and traction, some more so than in other areas. Particularly, they were able to influence the private sector power purchase agreements to ensure that, you know, if Google wants to buy renewable energy, that when they're buying it, they're buying energy that comes with a demand to not harm conservation areas or wildlife. And then they also were able to gain a lot of traction around influencing the research on renewable technologies that are wildlife friendly. They had a little bit less success with the state level collaborations on where government places renewable energy projects on non-federal lands, but that's something that they still are putting some energy into. So, you know, it's a very nice example, one, of coalition work and where different organizations come to a group with different strengths. And that helped them adapt, as well as some outside perspective that could help them reflect and look at scenarios. And then them trying to find the opportunities that were presented by the disruption and the risk. So I think that's all that I will say on that for the moment, but please feel free to circle back with questions after Will finishes.
Sure. Thank you, Ama. That's great. Sorry,
Will, we only have 2 minutes, so I'm not sure if you want
fine. So last two slides then quickly.
Okay.
Caroline, so the next slide just sort of summarizes in a way recommendations. If you're an organization, and I guess we've talked through these points, but just this just summarizes them for you. And that you'll see in the report, this, you know, it gives you some pointers as to what you can actually do. But a lot depends on, you've got to adapt this for your organization or your program, your context. And think what can you actually do? Do you have the capacity in place to be able to really engage on some of these topics, or do you need to build that, or do you need to do that through partners? And then just the last slide, we have got some ideas on next steps, or Emma has proposed some of those in the report. Some of this, I think, is very much dependent on us as organizations as to what we want to do individually in taking this forward. Clearly, it could be more of an ongoing learning exercise, and we could manage it as more of an ongoing CMP initiative if there's interest. So there's some ideas there, and we'd welcome any input, and if there isn't so much time now, we could follow up afterwards perhaps. Thanks.
Really good stuff, Will and colleagues.
Right. Do we have any questions? We have a little bit of time.
Hi, Will. It's Rachel. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, this is Carolyn. I'm just going to put in a comment here that was in the chat box from Sherry from Summit.
Thank you. Go ahead, Rachel.
something that people were very excited about it, that by keeping it simple and tied to tools that you're already using, it will encourage you guys to begin piloting and talking to each other more, bringing other people into the conversation, particularly diverse voices at the local level. So fewer international organizations, or those organizations still participating, but seeing what this means for a more local level charity, say in Peru. And just to say that I would be happy to talk to any of you guys further about this, but I really encourage you to continue the conversation and see what can be garnered from other sectors, but also not be discouraged by the fact that there isn't something that's already prepackaged. Part of it is just that, particularly in the charity sectors, even international development, there doesn't seem to be kind of one go-to tool. So thank you.
Thank you,
This is
Ama. Well, I
Pauline.
think you've, yeah, go, Scary, carry on.
Yeah. No, sorry, I was just going to say, this is a great topic. We had a internal team meeting last week, and this issue of political uncertainty came up, and how as a funder we should be both internally and using this as a tool to assess, but then also sharing with our partners abroad. So I would definitely be circulating the paper and hopefully a link to his presentation. And I agree, this is a beginning conversation that applies to everywhere in the world now, not just some of the areas of high biodiversity that we work in.